tensions, particularly in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. This area is at the center of the Belt and Road Initiative, enabling land corridors to Central Asia, South Asia, and Europe. And I'm convinced that stability and security in this region can be facilitated by policies which demonstrate the authorities' respect of all people's rights. In India, where there has also been significant poverty reduction in overall terms, inequality remains a serious issue. In addition, we're receiving reports that indicate increasing harassment and targeting of minorities, in particular Muslims and people with historically disadvantaged and marginalized groups such as Dalits and Adivasis. It appears that narrow political agendas are driving the further marginalization of vulnerable people. I fear that this divisive policy would not only harm many individuals, but also undermine the success of India's economic growth story. Mr. President, inequalities are a driver of several of the global trends which are of greatest concern to this and other intergovernmental bodies. Involuntary and precarious migration is a case in point. Armed conflicts is frequently cited as a root cause of involuntary migration. But time and again, we see that involuntary displacement and conflict are both being driven by inequalities and their underlying factors, including poverty, discrimination, oppression, violence, poor governance, climate change, and violation of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Caught in this downward spiral, people, and especially young people, may feel oppressed and robbed of their rights, leading them to migrate, often in precarious ways, to seek a life of dignity. So this is a challenge which together we can address by taking on the comprehensive and balanced human rights measures outlined in the Global Compact for Migration, which was adopted in Marrakesh on Human Rights Day last December. The continuing movement of people from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to the United States is a result of failure to ensure that development reaches everyone, with persistent violations of rights leading to profound inequalities. The comprehensive development plan being developed by Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and ECLAC is a welcome response to this challenge, very much in line with the Global Compact for Migration. In Mexico, too, the government is making efforts to move from an approach focused on detention and deportation of migrants to a new focus on protection of the rights of migrants, including opportunities for regularization and alternatives to detention. In the United States, the new migrant protection protocols, which restrict access to asylum and other forms of human rights protection, and push migrants back across the border to wait for their proceedings without due process of safeguards, are a source of concern. A recent report by the Inspector General for the United States Department of Health and Human Services indicates that thousands more migrant children have been separated from their families than had been previously reported. The office has raised concern with Australia about the imminent transfer of migrants from Manu Island and Nauru to new detention centers. Those people have been suffering for more than 6 years. More humane policies could and should be implemented. I am encouraged by recent announcements from the European Union expressing interest in setting up broader channels for regular migration as an integral element of sound migration governance. My office looks forward to providing guidance on setting up these pathways. We also look forward to helping ensure that cooperation agreements with countries of origin and transit comply with international human rights law. I commend Germany's successful programs to help migrants integrate into the economy and society, as well as legislation in several countries, including Finland, Portugal, and Spain, which enable the entry and stay of migrants in vulnerable situations based on human rights grounds. I'm troubled about other aspects of European migration policies, particularly the numbers of fatalities in the Mediterranean. Another 226 deaths were recorded in the first 2 months of this year, with several NGO vessels forced to suspend operations by measures that essentially criminalize solidarity. The ancient responsibility of rescue at sea is increasingly falling on merchant vessels, which are often ill-suited to such a task. In addition, some governments have refused entry to ships. I call on the EU and its member states to prioritize the lives and safety of migrants crossing the Mediterranean, strengthen search and rescue measures, permit NGO rescues and coordinate swift and safe disembarkation of these human beings, while at the same time tackling the root causes of this migration. Mr. President, inequalities also undermine peace and security by fueling grievances, extremism, and conflict. In the Sahel, the Office has been implementing an innovative approach aimed at reducing the risk of harm to civilians during counter-terrorism operations. OHCHR is working with the G5 Sahel Joint Force operating in Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger to establish a compliance framework to guide military operations. A training program is underway. Standard operating procedures are being developed which aim to reduce civilian harm and ensure sensitivity to gender issues. And a network of legal advisors is being established within the Joint Force to ensure the operational application of international human rights and humanitarian law. Comprehensive efforts which take measures across the spectrum of rights so they can work in synergy will have the greatest impact on terrorism and conflict. We need greater investment in justice and in upholding economic and social rights. The Office seeks to expand its engagement with governments and civil society in the region to address a broader range of human rights issues. I encourage Cameroon to also consider the benefits of such an approach. Last month, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights noted the heavy-handed approach of the security forces to the crisis in the northwest and southwest regions, including destruction of medical facilities, schools, essential infrastructure, and entire villages. I note the statement at this Council by the Minister of External Relations indicated that investigation of alleged violation by security forces are underway and sanctions will be applied. I'm also concerned by alarming instances of hate speech, including by political leaders, as well as serious restrictions on the political space with prosecutions in a military court of a number of members of opposition parties. It is essential that steps be taken now to de-escalate the increasing crisis in the country and prevent a further descent into violence. In Myanmar, economic interest and activities appears to be a key factor driving both violence and displacement by the Myanmar military, together with the dehumanization of the Rohingyas, a long-term discrimination. I am concerned by the failure to take any meaningful measures towards the safe, dignified, voluntary, and sustainable return of the Rohingyas and others in compliance with their rights to citizenship and other rights. The ceasefire agreements now in place in some regions appear to be having some positive effect. However, armed clashes in Rakhine State between the army and the mainly Buddhist Arakan armed group are taking on new magnitude with further impact on civilians. Establishing the conditions for the refugee to return voluntarily in safety and dignity must be a priority, alongside measures to ensure that the rights of ethnic and religious minorities will be fully respected, including the Rohingyas' right to self-identify as Rohingya. Human rights are essential to peace. This fact is almost universally acknowledged, but too often it is not translated into action. In the context of the various talks involving the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, broadening the issues under discussions to address severe human rights violations could support concrete outcomes to benefit the population of the DPRK. It can also help the talks attain their overall objective of lasting peace and security. In Syria, justice and accountability will remain essential to any reconciliation, and I call on the governments and other actors to provide full information to all families about what has happened to the many men, women, and children who are missing and those who are detained. I remain particularly concerned about the rising toll of civilian death in Idlib governorate. All parties must ensure that the thousands of civilians fleeing formerly ISIL-held territory receive adequate protection and assistance. and I joined the Special Envoy's call for a comprehensive political solution. In Yemen, I'm deeply concerned by the suffering of civilians, despite the current ceasefire. This remains the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The conflict has not just killed and injured thousands of civilians. It has brought famine, deprived people of the most essential goods and services, and destroyed vital infrastructure and a unique cultural heritage. The debilitating consequences of injuries from airstrikes, shelling, landmines, and acute malnutrition, especially for children, as a result of obstruction of humanitarian assistance, will scar the country's future for generations. I commend the mediation efforts of the Special Envoy, the United Nations mission to support the Hodeidah Agreement, and the continuing work of the group of eminent experts. The people of Yemen deserve all the elements for lives of dignity, beginning with peace and accountability. Mr. President, amid these negative trends, there are some hopeful areas in which far-sighted leadership seeks to advance civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights to ensure a convergence of positive and constructive forces. In Ethiopia, reforms have sought to address a wide spectrum of human rights issues, including benefits to sustainable development. The depth and pace of Prime Minister Abiy's political and economic reforms and the appointment of women to senior positions could open the path to a more inclusive and effective development model, providing hope for Ethiopia's young population. My office will continue to assist the government to devise sound laws, mend grievances, and set up measures to prevent violence in areas of the country. Ethiopians can be proud of the achievement of gender parity in government, as well as the first women president and first women chief justice. Elsewhere, too, we continue to make some progress with respect to women's leadership and women's equality. Last year, a woman was elected mayor of the capital of Tunisia, in a region where women have the lowest levels of political representations in the world. A record number of women were elected recently to the US Congress and mark important steps for diversity. They included the first Muslim American congresswoman, the first Native American congresswoman, and the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. I hail all powerful women around the world and the model they present to the next generation. But in many parts of the world, women are attacked, preyed upon, exploited, silenced, and robbed of their dignity and rights. Sexual violence continues to be rampant in conflict situations, with many victims targeted based on their perceived ethnic, religious, political, or clan affiliation. Migrant women and girls are also at high risk of gender-based violence. On the 25 countries with the highest rates of femicide in the world, 14 are in Latin America and the Caribbean, while 1 in 5 women in the European Union have experienced physical or sexual violence by a current or former partner. At this session, the Council's Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders presents a report on the rising attacks on and repression of women's human rights defenders in the context of today's backlash against women's human rights. It makes clear that women defenders face the same risk as men, but with additional threats shaped by a view that women should be bound to the service of a male-dominated society. Physical and sexual violence, public shaming, including on the internet, and attacks on their families and children are among the tactics increasingly used to silence women activists. Recently, a group of 30 women leaders issued an open letter emphasizing the urgency and peril of the current rollbacks to hard-won rights and freedoms. I fully share their concerns and will continue to work against gender inequalities with all the energy and principle that I can muster. Mr. President, allow me to note that during this Council session, my office will present thematic reports and country-specific oral updates on reports, including on Afghanistan, Colombia, Cyprus, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Guatemala, Honduras, Iran, Libya, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, Venezuela, and Yemen, as well on the occupied Palestinian territory. Last month, during our informal discussion, I raised the situation in a number of countries in the context of prevention and early warning of escalating human rights violations. Before closing today, I would like to add a few additional situations of increasing concern. In Libya, escalating violence since the beginning of the year, in particularly hostilities in the city of Derna and in the south of the country, could spark an even more chaotic situation, given the increasingly fragmented political context and continuing lawlessness. Armed groups which fall outside of effective state command and control structures, but which are integrated into state institutions, continue to commit grave violations of international humanitarian and human rights law throughout the countries in almost complete impunity. The number of civilians killed and injured in 2018, as documented by UNSMIL and OHCHR, was 40% higher than in 2017. Prevention measures should be considered a matter of urgency. I remain concerned about the ongoing tensions in Kashmir, as shelling and firing on both sides of the line of control continue to contribute to loss of life and displacement. I encourage both India and Pakistan to invite my office to monitor the situation on the ground and to assist both states to address the human rights issues that must be part of any solution to the conflict. In the Philippines, several sources now estimate that up to 27,000 people may have been killed in the context of the campaign against illegal drugs since mid-2016. Despite serious allegations of extrajudicial killings, only one case, the widely reported killing of a teenage boy, has been subject to investigation and prosecution. People who have fallen into the trap of drug reliance need help to rebuild their lives. Drugs policies should not be more of a threat to their lives than the drugs they are abusing. I encourage the Philippines to adopt a public health approach and harm reduction initiatives that comply with human rights standards as recommended to the 2016 General Assembly Special Session. I also note that special rapporteurs of this Council have been subject to threats, and opposition politicians, human rights defenders, and journalists have been threatened, attacked, and jailed. I'm also extremely concerned by Congress' consideration of measures to introduce the death penalty for drug-related crimes and reduce the age of criminal responsibility from 15 to 12 or even 9 years old. The drug policies in place in the Philippines and its lack of respect for rule and law and international standards should not be considered a model by any country. Distinguished President, we have seen that inequalities and the failure to give equal weight and respect to all human rights have the power to erode all three pillars of the UN: peace and security, development, and human rights. Inequality threatens our opportunity to achieve sustainable, inclusive development. Inequality stirs grievances and unrest, fuel hatred, violence, and threats to peace, and force people to leave their homes and countries. Inequalities undermine social progress and economic and political stability. But human rights build hope. They bind humanity together with shared principles and a better future, in sharp contrast to the divisive, destructive forces of repression, exploitation, scapegoating, discrimination, and inequalities. And some countries, not always the richest in income or resources, are choosing to adopt principled and more effective policies grounded in the full range of human rights. By taking steps to advance civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights as mutually reinforcing, they can count on building a strong basis for sustainable development and social harmony. Our office will always be open to assisting this endeavor. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Madame la Haut-Commissaire pour son rapport. Mesdames et Messieurs, nous allons maintenant faire une petite pause technique avant de continuer le dialogue interactif avec le rapporteur spécial sur les droits des personnes handicapées et l'expert indépendant sur l'exercice des droits de l'homme par les personnes atteintes d'albinisme. Je vous remercie.